In 1945, when Harlem was a battleground for power, law, and order, Sheriff Walker made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his badge and status gave him untouchable power, believing he could act with impunity. He thought he could destroy anyone who crossed him, no matter their legacy or their bloodline. He had no idea that he was about to face Bumpy Johnson, a man who could transform his entire life with one swift move. This is the story of how Sheriff Walker's arrogance led him down a dark road, one that would culminate in a reckoning that would echo for generations. Sheriff Walker stood tall, unflinching, behind his desk in his office, a man who wore his power like a second skin. His uniform, pressed and pristine, gleamed under the low light, a testament to his belief that authority could be bought, manipulated, and wielded. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who saw the world in black and white, with himself at the top of the hierarchy. In his eyes, the black community in Harlem were little more than pawns, at his mercy, deserving of whatever fate he dealt them. His relationship with Bumpy Johnson had always been one of cold disdain. The sheriff had no respect for the numbers game Bumpy had built, something that transcended law and order, something more powerful than the police. He believed himself above the rules, and he would never allow a man like Bumpy to stand in his way. Sheriff Walker controlled Harlem's streets with the same authority he'd used to keep his family's reputation intact. His connections to the politicians, the judges, and the city's elite made him feel untouchable, and yet his arrogance blinded him. He had crossed a line that would lead to the most fatal of consequences, not only for him, but for his family too. In a chilling twist, it was not just a random victim of the sheriff's cruelty that would come to haunt him. It was a bloodline. The daughter of the man he had lynched, the uncle of Bumpy Johnson. The very man whose bloodline would one day wash his car, waiting for the moment to avenge the years of pain. Sheriff Walker's decision to lynch Bumpy's uncle in the mid-1920s had been an act of blatant power and dominance. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the deliberate disregard for justice, the message it sent. The sheriff had thought he was sending a message to the community of Harlem, reminding them that no one, no matter their power, could escape his reach. But what Walker failed to understand was that the world doesn't forget, and neither does Harlem. For Bumpy Johnson, his family's legacy had always been a cornerstone of his life. That tragic day when his uncle had been unjustly lynched left a scar not just on his heart, but on the fabric of Harlem itself. The anger, the loss, the thirst for justice, it had been buried deep within him. And now, 25 years later, that thirst was beginning to bubble to the surface once again. Bumpy Johnson was not just a man, he was a force. The lessons he learned as a child, the ones taught to him by his uncle, had shaped him into the formidable figure who had risen from the shadows of the streets to become a living legend. The sheriff's mistake had always been thinking that he could erase Bumpy's family from history. But the truth was, Bumpy's family, his blood, was written into the very foundation of Harlem. And now that legacy was coming to collect. It started when Sheriff Walker got too comfortable. Sitting behind his desk in his luxurious office, he didn't think anyone could touch him. His power had been unchallenged for years. But on that fateful afternoon, a routine act of disrespect would be the spark that ignited the storm. Bumpy Johnson's uncle, the man who had helped raise him, had always stood tall against injustice. He had been a prominent figure in the Harlem community, a respected businessman with influence among the people. Sheriff Walker, eager to remind Harlem who truly held the power, saw an opportunity. He accused Bumpy's uncle of a crime he didn't commit, a trumped-up charge, a way for Walker to send a message. The day the lynching happened, Bumpy's uncle had been dragged from his home by the sheriff's men, paraded through the streets as a display of force. The community stood frozen in horror, but no one dared step forward. Walker had already made it clear, anyone who crossed him would meet the same fate. As the mob hanged Bumpy's uncle, a hush fell over the crowd. But in the background, a young Bumpy watched, silent from the shadows. He hadn't understood then the full weight of the event, but he knew something deep in his bones. This wasn't just a death. It was a declaration of war. That same afternoon, as the body of his uncle swayed in the breeze, Bumpy's destiny was sealed. It would take years, but the sheriff's bloodline would come to regret that moment. It was years later when Bumpy first heard of Sheriff Walker's passing. He had built his empire on the foundations of those dark days in Harlem, but he had never forgotten the family he lost, nor the man responsible for it. And so, when the sheriff's daughter, Linda Walker, came to him with an offer to wash his car daily, Bumpy felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. Linda, still young, was no longer the arrogant daughter of a lawman, but a woman trying to erase the shadows of her father's legacy. She approached Bumpy, the same man whose life had been shaped by the blood of her father's victim, and with trembling hands offered a peace offering, a way to atone. Bumpy's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, remembering the face of the man who had taken his uncle's life. But Bumpy wasn't a man to be swayed by simple gestures. He wasn't interested in the washed-out apologies of someone born into a family that had caused so much pain. Instead, he saw an opportunity to show just how deep the roots of vengeance ran, and how it wasn't just about getting even. It was about respect, and respect was earned, not given. Bumpy looked at Linda, his gaze calm but full of calculated intent. "I'll tell you this once," he said, voice steady but carrying weight. "You're not washing my car to apologize for your father. You're washing it because you don't understand what he did." The sheriff's daughter, confused and uncertain, didn't understand the significance of what she had started. To her, it was an act of contrition. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't in the business of forgiveness, not for those who had wronged him. As Linda washed his car every day, Bumpy watched her movements, each stroke of the rag against the chrome symbolic of something deeper. Bumpy was calculating, planning. He knew that the time for revenge wasn't yet ripe, but the moment would come. And when it did, it would be swift and final. For weeks, Linda Walker came, day after day, washing the car with a devotion that seemed to only deepen the wound her family had inflicted. Bumpy let her go about her work. He didn't speak much, but his mind was constantly turning. Every action Linda took was a reminder to Bumpy. Every time she bent down to scrub the wheels, he remembered the man who had killed his uncle. But Bumpy wasn't in a hurry. He knew that justice needed to be delivered at the right moment. Too early, and it wouldn't resonate. Too late, and it would lose its power. He waited, his plan unfolding like a slow, deliberate chess game. The sheriff's daughter didn't know it, but she was already part of the trap he had set for her father's legacy. As Linda's routine continued, Bumpy's patience finally began to pay off. It was in the early summer, a time when Harlem's heat bore down, that Bumpy made his move. Linda had been washing his car now for several weeks, and as each day passed, the weight of the past seemed to hang heavier over her. The blood of her father's sins had never been far from her, and with every wiped surface, she tried to wipe away the guilt she couldn't shake. Bumpy had been watching, listening, waiting for the exact moment. He knew that Linda would come to him with an offer, a final gesture of contrition. She would seek his approval, perhaps even forgiveness. But Bumpy wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in justice. It was a humid afternoon in August when Sheriff Walker's daughter, Linda, arrived at Bumpy's doorstep with a new sense of urgency. There was a change in her demeanor, something different from the previous days. She wasn't just there to wash the car anymore. She had something to prove. Linda's eyes, once filled with hesitation, now carried the weight of the years her family had tried to bury. She approached Bumpy's front porch, standing tall, looking almost defiant, but also searching for something, perhaps for absolution, perhaps for closure. Bumpy, as always, watched from his chair on the porch, his eyes sharp and unwavering. As she walked up, she set the rag down in the sun, her hands trembling slightly. Her gaze met his, and she spoke, her voice softer than before. "I didn't ask for this life, but my father's sins, those are my burden too. I need you to understand that I'm not him." Bumpy's eyes locked on hers, and for a long moment, the air was thick with silence. Linda stood there, waiting for a response, unsure of what would come next. Bumpy slowly stood, his calm demeanor masking the fury that churned beneath the surface. He walked toward her, his footsteps steady, each one purposeful. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with gravity. "Your father's sins don't just end with him, you know. They linger, and they have a way of making sure you never forget. But me, I don't need your apology." Linda's breath caught, her chest tightening with the realization that nothing she could offer would make this right. Bumpy's eyes hardened as he continued. "You've been washing my car every day because of what your father did, and that, in your mind, is your way of saying sorry. But I don't need your sorry. I needed you to understand something else. The respect your father took from me, it doesn't come back with a rag and soap. It comes back with what's owed, and what's owed is far more than any apology." Linda froze, realization dawning on her. In that moment, she understood that Bumpy's justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about setting things right, regardless of the consequences. The heat hung in the air, heavy with the weight of that understanding. Sheriff Walker's daughter had just learned the lesson her father had never taught her. In Harlem, you pay your debts. And sometimes the price of justice isn't measured in money or apologies. It's measured in blood. And now, for the first time, she saw Bumpy Johnson not as the man who owned Harlem, but as the man who had been wronged and would right it, no matter the cost. The confrontation that followed was swift, precise, and unyielding. Bumpy knew the power of the legacy his uncle had left behind, and he knew how to use it to bring about justice. As Linda stood there, her hands still gripping the rag she'd used to wash his car, Bumpy moved like a man with purpose. He didn't hesitate. He had waited for this moment for years, and now it was here. His actions were quiet. No loud declarations, no extravagant displays. He simply picked up the phone, dialed a number he knew by heart, and spoke with the calm assurance that had come to define him. "Make sure he's here tonight," Bumpy said, his voice like steel. "It's time we settle this." Within hours, the sheriff's former allies, the men who had enabled his reign, began to fall away, each one retreating into the shadows where they belonged. Bumpy's reach had always been long, but now it was undeniable. The sheriff's family, his influence, and his legacy were slipping through his fingers. Just like the power he had once used to control the streets, Bumpy's grip was firm, but he didn't act with rage. He acted with purpose. By the time the sheriff's men arrived, Bumpy was waiting, his expression calm but filled with resolve. The sheriff's family, his daughter, and his remaining allies would never understand the depth of the respect they had failed to acknowledge. But Bumpy understood it completely. Justice had been delivered, not with the flash of violence, but with the certainty that Bumpy's name would never again be tied to the wrongs of a man who thought himself untouchable. The days that followed were filled with quiet whispers in Harlem, the kind that always followed the delivery of Bumpy Johnson's justice. Sheriff Walker's name, once spoken with a mix of fear and respect, began to fade into the background. His daughter Linda had paid her price, not just with daily tasks, but with the understanding that the sins of her father were too great to wash away with any simple act. For Bumpy, the victory was bittersweet. He hadn't sought vengeance, he had sought respect, and now it had been earned. The community breathed a sigh of relief. Injustice, though it lingered, had been confronted. Bumpy's actions had sent a message, one that echoed across the streets of Harlem. Respect was a currency that could not be stolen without consequences. And as for Linda Walker, her life had been irrevocably changed. She had not only witnessed the power of Bumpy's justice, but had become part of the legacy of Harlem itself. Whether she knew it or not, she had played a role in rewriting history. In the years that followed, people would talk about the sheriff who tried to oppress Harlem, and they would talk about Bumpy Johnson, the man who brought justice to those who thought they were untouchable. And though Bumpy's name would live on, it would forever be tied to one simple, powerful truth. Respect always triumphs over power. As the legend of Bumpy Johnson continues to echo through the streets of Harlem, we're reminded that in this life, there's always a price to pay for disrespect. Sheriff Walker thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, but in the end, the streets always remember. So, if this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem, and in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bumpy? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.